Mansion of Hidden Souls, released for the Sega Saturn in 1994. This game is personally significant because it's the first Saturn game I ever owned, and I mostly bought it to test out my then brand spanking second-hand Sega Saturn system, see if that was working properly, since it was the only game I could find for the Saturn at the time. Once I knew the system was working, Mansion was stashed away and never touched again. Until today. Because I had just bought Shinobi Legions and I played the heck out of that game instead. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, Mansion of Hidden Souls is an interactive full-motion video point-and-click game, so to speak, where you navigate a mansion of hidden souls, butterflies, and disembodied heads that will appear out of nowhere to speak to you.
You'd better get a move on.
I am drastically underselling the premise here because there's a bit of a story to this one, and while it's not the greatest story ever conceived, it's enough to push the game forward.
You'd better get a move
But I am
on.
just put off by the floating heads that show up to speak to me. It's like I'm taking a getaway trip to the old country home to visit Zordon's extended family or something to that extent, but I digress. Anyway, as you can imagine, the majority of Mansion of Hidden Souls is played through pre-rendered video sequences depicted from a first-person perspective as you're navigating this mansion. You use the D-pad to move around. Up moves forward while left and right turns. The X button brings up menu. And A and C buttons are reserved for answering yes or no during conversations you have with these floating heads. And how you interact with these other characters has greater consequences on the grand scheme of things. And that's the thick of it, really. You navigate the halls, you examine things that are able to be examined, and you talk to floating heads. If you're looking for something a little more exciting to do, then you may want to steer clear of Mansion of Hidden Souls, because this is the most excitement you're going to get. The gameplay here is very basic, with fairly limited interactivity overall, even for a pseudo point-and-click adventure game. It boils down to roaming around the house until you run into a floating head or some other event. Maybe you can examine a couple things here and there, and that's about it. It's essentially a walking simulator. The whole game is driven by its storyline, which probably would have made more sense had I played the Sega CD game of the same name, of which the Saturn release is a sequel to. As it is, the floating heads and the limited gameplay ended up being the biggest takeaways from this game, and I ended up being pretty bored with this one. There's a reason why I abandoned this one as soon as I got something more exciting for Saturn, and clearly there's an audience for this sort of thing that I'm not a part of, and that's fine. Your mileage may vary, and this sort of thing may be appealing to you. I can only speak from my own experience, and eventually with a stockpile of caffeinated drinks on hand, I powered through and was able to complete Mansion of Hidden Souls within the span of an hour. Not exactly a huge time sink, but more than what I ever really needed from this game. However, you do have the ability to save your progress, which is a nice feature to have for this sort of thing. Assuming your Sega Saturn system has the ability to save games, which might be an issue if your battery is dead and you don't have a memory card saving gimmick, which is kind of difficult to come across these days, but the feature is nice to have regardless. There's also an easy mode, but the only difference between this and normal mode is the appearance of on-screen button prompts letting you know when to interact with a character. No such prompt pops up in normal mode, but you could easily tell when you should be responding by whether the head stops animating so. Mansion of Hidden Souls is a largely FMV-based game, so there's a lot of pre-rendered full-motion video goodness to be had here. And when I say goodness, I mean, well, you know, for 1995, I suppose it was fine looking. I'd imagine this looks slightly better than its Sega CD predecessor, because the Saturn could do better quality FMVs, but the actual graphics, the CG and stuff, isn't really anything special, and certainly hasn't held up over the years. The floating heads aren't all that great looking either, but I do like the semi-transparent look. It gives the heads an eerie vibe. Okay, more of an eerie vibe. The floating heads are eerie enough, I suppose. The audio side of things doesn't fare much better either, and a lot of that has to do with the mediocre voice acting. This was long before the days of hiring professional voice actors to provide words to these digital characters and getting some quality performances as a result. This was taking whoever was in the office that day, giving him a piece of paper, and telling him to read said piece of paper into a microphone inside a cardboard box. Presumably the same recording conditions that brought you the vocal tracks for Symphony of the Night. To be fair, The performances in general are passable, but nothing that stands out or enhances the material. There's some occasional musical bits which are fairly forgettable, and the ever-constant ticking clock that will eat away at your very being until you yourself are nothing but a floating head in a jar. Overall, Mansion of Hidden Souls is an FMV game that plays like most FMV games of the time, lots of fancy, cheaply made video with limited interactivity and gameplay. It tries to provide a compelling narrative to push things forward, but the production aspects along with some design choices drag the package down a bit. For those who are into this sort of thing, it might be worth checking out if you can find a cheap enough copy, but there are far better games to be playing on the Sega Saturn, or within the point-and-click adventure genre, hell, even within the realm of FMV games for that matter. And Mansion of Hidden Souls needs not be entered into consideration.